Welcome Internet to Psychologist Casual Review, and today we're going to be reviewing The Repression and Return of the Bad Objects with special reference to war neurosis, written by Fairbairn in 1943. So this paper is very important on multiple levels. First and foremost, it's a critique of Freud's theory of repression. It's the elaboration of the moral defense, and third, it is an application of his theories into the realm of trauma. So, in essence, it's a very, very important paper if you're interested in Fairbairn's theory. Now, let us begin with the start of the text. In the start of the text, Fairbairn is going to point out and explain Freud's theory of repression. For Freud, it's very simple. There are unconscious drives that are unconcilable with consciousness, drives that are that of incest and of aggression. They're so unacceptable that we repress them into our unconscious minds. But the reason of the repression is due to guilt. Fairbairn is going to challenge that, because for him, it doesn't really hold water. And he explains that when he met children that were victims of abuse, even sexual abuse, they would deny or try and repress those elements, but not because they were guilty of fantasizing them, but because those elements drawed a lot of tension in the mind and out of the stress. The idea that they would come back is what caused a lot of suffering. And for Fairbairn, it's because what is happening when they really talk about that trauma is that it awakens the bad object within. So what happens within Fairbairn's theory is that when there are violence, neglect and abuse, the child is going to internalize a bad object. That bad object is part of the inner world. That inner world of the child is there to try and contain the badness of the object and the bad object. And when they're repressed, the bad object is pushed down into a realm in which the child no longer on the surface needs to deal with it. But, and this is a big but, when the therapist tries and free the repression, what happens is the bad object comes forward and fundamentally all of the badness comes back. So it's very different from Freud. As for Fairbairn, it's not about guilt. It's about fundamentally re-experiencing, reliving the suffering and what happened at the hands of the bad object. I.e., it's just like, how can I say, pressing repeat on a remote. It's the same experience that comes back with all the violence and the hate that was associated with the event. So why does the child internalize the bad object? Well, it's part of the theory of Fairbairn that we are never objectless, that the libido is object-seeking and not pleasure-seeking. So for him, what happens is that the child, even though the child suffers enormously, it's still preferable for the child to suffer but have a relationship rather than no relationship at all, which in Fairbairn's assessment is like being destroyed. So it's better to have bad elements. There's also an underlying fantasy, which he points out incredibly well in the article, that the child, by integrating the bad object, is also going to try and purge the bad object and the relationship of its badness, of all the things that have gone wrong, by blaming themselves. So that internal blame is there to try and free the object of everything wrong. That the child takes it upon itself to have the burden of guilt. For Fairbairn, this is because in this lies an intrinsic hope. The hope that by absorbing the badness of the other, that the other will become available, good, and loving and kind towards a child, and thus be able to fix the child. For Fairbairn, he gives the analogy of it's better to be a sinner in God's world than a good person in a world ruled by the devil. This is because in the case of being a sinner in God's world, you can always be forgiven for your sins. That this is not an absolute end or death threat that something of hope is maintained. Whereas if you're a good person in the world ruled by the devil, it's hopeless. You're gonna get destroyed. So for the child, it's like an evidence that they will keep the bad object, put them in themselves, purge the bad object of the badness, assume the guilt in the hope that they will be fixed, which creates a big problem, because these are gonna build upon patterns of suffering, in which the child will repeat that with other people, not just the parents or the caregivers that were pathological, but with other people. What's gonna happen afterwards is that fundamentally in therapy, when you start to work on trauma, those people might, rather than sacrifice that dynamic, run from therapy. Why? Because fundamentally the whole process of realizing that the object is bad is too destructive, because they're afraid that then all hope is lost, and then therefore the bad object and the whole dynamic have to be conserved regardless of how much suffering is acquired. And this creates a lot of problems in psychotherapy, as people might cut off from therapy rather than engaging in deconstructing that bad object, that internalized bad object. And they might prefer to save the parent mentally rather than save themselves, because that's what they've done all their lives. So therapy can be a threat. He also states, very interestingly enough, that if you play the role of a superego in therapy, i.e. if you're trying to do morals wisdom with the patients, well, it's not going to work. You're going to create struggle. If you're good enough, secure enough, what's going to happen is that the patient's going to feel secure enough in the relationship to be able to exhume and put forward all the trauma that they've lived, to be able to unrepress and bring to consciousness all the trauma, because they know that you're going to be there for them, and you're going to be able to create a catharsis, as Fairbairn points out, of the traumatic experience. I.e., it's not just that by transference they feel that you can hold on. It's really that you're creating a secure, stable relationship in which hope has been answered. That fundamental hope which pushed them to internalize the bad object can be answered in therapy. Answered through secure, stable, and relationship that's very coherent and through time, and which has its own boundaries. So fundamentally for Fairbairn, therapy is a way of solving this issue, an issue that he calls the moral defense, as the child is fundamentally pushed to internalize the bad, to try and preserve the relationship, the external bad object. So that's what Fairbairn calls a moral defense. And for him, that's at the core experience of trauma, as a moral defense is there to try and fight against the repressed. The repression that's there because fundamentally it's maintained, because in a certain way it gives some form of mental hope that's enough to create a system in which a child and then afterwards the adult can function. But then that functionality is very fragile, as noted by Fairbairn, that if you have an external force, a trauma, an event that's going to happen, it's going to reawake all of that distress, because that distress is not gone, it's like buried. But unfortunately there's a high chance that something is going to unlock that buried trauma, and then everything's going to come out. And it's in those moments that people seek therapy rather than before, as before they also have the hope that everything will solve itself, so to speak. So what's also very, very interesting in Fairbairn's paper is that for him the superego has two sides. It has a side of maintaining the bad object far away, but it's also an internalization of the good elements of the relationship, i.e. the limits, the care, So there is that part, but it's unfortunately in this system it's used to maintain the knowledge of the bad object repressed. So it's not an all good entity, of course. And fundamentally, for Fairbairn, the moral defense is very clearly visible in abused children and war neurosis, what we now call PTSD after wartime. For him, what happens is that fundamentally the bad object is reawakened by the trauma of war. It is not necessarily like bombshells, even though it can be part of it. But it's also going to be things like, for example, an uncaring commissar, surgeon that's going to yell onto the soldiers. It's going to be the refusal of going to see their wives, and so on and so forth. That's going to create a relationship in which the person feels that they are being mistreated, and fundamentally it's going to create this whole dynamic of a moral defense. And fundamentally for him, and it's very funny because he ends the article on this note, is that what is needed is less psychotherapy and more a moral strengthening of the group, as it's really a group effort rather than a psychotherapeutic effort to try and help the war neurotics or people suffering from PTSD. So it's an interesting point of view. I don't really agree with it, but it's still very interesting. On the whole, this paper is really, really good if you want to understand the internal dynamics of someone that has been traumatized. Because unfortunately, we are, even though things are getting much better on that front, we still are under the deceitfulness of a form of simplicity in which we believe that if a relationship is bad, then it's easy, you just leave. But because there's this fundamental hope that the relationship can be purged and then become a good one, this hope is so strong, as noted by Fairbairn, that it overpowers any form of leaving. So fundamentally, I think that what he pointed out in this text over 80 years ago is still very valid. And I feel that it's a classic, even though we are not trained with it. I think it's a very good text to be able to think and elaborate on traumatic events and the internalization of trauma within the individual. So that's pretty much it for this review. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.